Hello everybody. Today we're discussing the Internationals. They were a series of 4 large-scale meetings of prominent socialists set between 1864 and 1938. They decided on the official doctrines of the socialist parties and movements, and they did stupendous amounts of infighting between all types of leftists, some of which lasted until today. For simplification, I would just call the Internationals by their number for this video, but I will mention their alternative names. I will explain all 4 official internationals, though of course what is and isn't official depends on who you ask. So, it will be the 4 ones commonly called the official ones. For every one, I will try to explain the ideological and historical background, as well as what they tried to do and what they failed to do. Hopefully this way you can gain a better understanding of the history, the way I did when I started researching this video. If you want more details on this video, make sure to subscribe to my second channel to catch my creator commentary stream, linked in the comment section. And if you're interested in political and historical topics covered from a leftist perspective, make sure to subscribe. I upload videos like this every Sunday. Oh, and also pay me on Patreon to join the Discord server and play Minecraft. Maybe don't, I don't know, only if you want to. You can also join the Discord if you hit the bell. Check out the link in the description for that. All that being said, let's finally start. The first international was called up in London in 1864. It was called the International Working Men's Association, but everybody would shorten it to International. And once the second happened, it was called the First International. This was very early in the history of leftism. At this point, Marx had released the Communist Manifesto, but it was before he finished Capital. Likewise, due to how early this is, a lot of anarchists were mutualists. This was a very early form of anarchism which would operate using a market. This is why it's a lot less popular now. Even though Marx had not finished Capital, he had been writing about his communist idea in workers' newspapers, so socialism itself was already very popular. So they called an international meeting to determine how the workers of the world can work together. There were many reasons they felt that this was necessary. A notable one is that if you somehow unionized all of the workers in a country and they went on a strike to secure better working conditions, the capitalists could just hire immigrants from foreign countries. Their solution was to make the workers of all places take part in one single struggle. This was basically the first instance of leftist internationalism. The representatives that met in London, who included Karl Marx and Mikhail Bakunin, unanimously voted to form an organization for all workers of the world. They selected a committee of 21 people to be the leaders of this organization. These people were charged, among other things, with writing a program and a constitution. They were made up of all manner of leaders, union representatives, philosophers, politicians, and so on. The committee immediately decided that they didn't want to write a program, so they made Karl Marx do it. They also decided that women should be able to become members. In 1865, that was revolutionary. Women had to vote in exactly 0 countries. That's a thing about communists. They always treat political minorities better than the mainstream parties, as you can see just by looking at my background. Of course, this movement, which reportedly had 8 million members, was plagued by the things leftists always had been plagued with: infighting. The 2 notable groups were the anarchists and libertarian socialists around Bakunin, and the state and party-focused Marxists around Marx. The main purpose of the International was to take these differences, discuss them, and then come to a compromise for all. Over the following 6 years, they voted to demand an 8-hour workday. They decided that they needed to get political and economic liberty, and that one can't happen without the other. And then the inevitable thing followed, and the Congress had to vote on what would the official revolutionary tactic for leftists be. Bakunin's or Marx's. They voted to go with Marx's idea for revolution, which is focused on parties. Which, of course, didn't end the debate, it just sparked debates about how much sense it made to have one Congress tell the socialist and anarchist parties what to do. In 1871, the Paris Commune happened, which I have an old video about. When it collapsed, the two groups around Marx and Bakunin had different views on what the Commune should have done. Marx said that they need a state to support the dictatorship of the proletariat, and Bakunin thought that this was just going to lead to party officials becoming a new ruling class that cannot represent the proletariat accurately. If you are a leftist, you have probably heard people still having that exact exchange today, 150 years later. Unsurprisingly, Marx and Bakunin couldn't make a compromise on this, so leftism is still divided between libertarian and authoritarian leftism. Then the Congress straight up kicked out Bakunin for refusing to accept Marx's theory of revolution after the Congress voted on it to be the official policy. This, of course, didn't end anarchism, and many followed Bakunin out of the Congress. And then the anarchists would hold their own congresses, calling themselves the First International, while the Marxists kept holding their congress called the First International. Both of them were saying that the other one is illegitimate and stinks. Of course, the enemies of leftism loved this. German Chancellor Bismarck remarked, "Crowned heads, wealth and privilege may well tremble, should ever again the black and red unite." Black and red referring to the anarchists and Marxists in this case. And so far, European leftists have done the crowned heads, wealth and privilege a great service by refusing to cooperate with each other. In conclusion, the International succeeded in uniting some unions with some Marxist parties, but it caused a massive split between Marxists and the anarchists, who would eventually develop syndicalism as a method for revolution without a state or party. So the First International was a mixed bag. After everyone was done yelling, it would eventually dissolve in 1877. Eventually, after both Karl Marx and Bakunin had died and a decade passed, the leftists of the world tried again and founded the Second International. It still had libertarian leftists and anarchists, but they excluded syndicalists, which didn't help them much because by this time syndicalists were a major power. By this time, leftism was a lot stronger in Europe. Despite many countries not having parliaments, there were socialist parties all over. Some libertarian, some authoritarian. Their first decision was to declare the 1st of May the official day of the workers. They reaffirmed their support for an 8-hour workday around the world, and they decided that they were 100% anti-war. Pretty much all attendees agreed with this. This was in the face of militarism in Europe rising before World War I. The Second International held more and more frantic meetings in the lead up to the war, trying to find ways to prevent workers dying for capitalists. After the assassination of the Archduke, but before the declaration of war, the Second International called upon all workers of the world to do everything to sabotage the mobilization effort. This did not work. The war started anyways. And to the dismay of the International, this immediately ruined everything. A lot of leftist parties like the SPD and SPÖ immediately rejected the International in favor of supporting their own country's war effort. They even told their members to suspend all strikes and demands for improvements of their lives for the sake of total war and victory against the evil outgroup. This was not just the parties. Almost everybody in these countries was enthusiastic for war. They thought this was the way to show the rest of the world their strength, and that they were sure the war was only last maybe 6 months. They were wrong. There would be meetings across the parties from each side of the war, but they never talked to their supposed enemies, or even the parties from the neutral countries. So, eventually, by 1920, the Second International was officially declared dead, though it had ceased to function since the start of the war. Part of the reason why the International didn't manage to reform after the war was that many of the previously revolutionary Marxist parties, like the German Social Democrats, had changed. This was a long process, but they slowly went from revolutionary socialists, like Marx advocated, to a party that was willing to compromise its ideas just to be in power in the capitalist democracy, effectively serving the capitalist state and economy while trying to secure some quality of life for the workers. This would be painfully obvious when the Social Democrats sided with the capitalist government and the rightist Freikorps when the Communist Party attempted to overthrow the government in the aftermath of the war. This caused a split among the socialists between reformists and revolutionaries. Reformists would eventually become what we now call Social Democrats, and they would attempt to work to better the workers' conditions within the liberal democratic framework. This is why they sided with their countries in the war. Effectively, this caused a split between revolutionary socialists and reformist Social Democrats. Parties like the Social Democrats in Germany eventually officially abandoned all pretexts of being communist or socialist. Instead, they decided to call themselves Social Democrats, which differentiated them from the more radical leftist movements. To that end, a lot of social democratic parties eventually formed the Socialist International, because it's not like words have meaning or something like that. As you know, in 1917, the October Revolution took place in Russia. In the aftermath of it, Vladimir Lenin was the ruler of the only country that had attempted socialism and didn't immediately collapse. So far. And of course, it caused a Russian civil war. But even before that war was over, Lenin, his party, and his government formed a new international. That was in 1919. During this time, Europe saw a lot of unrest. There was a socialist revolution in Hungary and more than one attempt at revolution in Germany. The Third International did what it could to support these revolutions, which was mostly financial support and sending advisors. They also decided that they would use the same mode of revolution as Lenin described in his works and carried out in Russia. That means forming parties that acted as a vanguard. They would also follow the ideas of democratic centralism, which basically means that they would debate an issue internally, and once they came to a conclusion, they would act like they all 100% believed in it in public, as to not splinter the movement. For the Second Congress, Lenin wrote down 21 conditions every communist party had to follow to be allowed as part of the Third International. It was immediately ratified by the Congress, but there were issues. For example, the conditions only allowed parties that followed democratic centralism, and it actually said that all communist parties in colonized countries need to support a union of the workers, the peasants, and the national bourgeoisie to fight off the imperial bourgeoisie. I don't need to explain why an alliance with the bourgeoisie didn't sit well with all those communists. Eventually, they debated the issue and took out the national bourgeoisie. But despite this, almost all parties that attended were torn on whether to stay in the Third International or not. So most of them split in two different parties. Yet another international splitting the left. This is also the origin of people calling themselves communist rather than socialist. Broadly, but not always, the ones who remained in the Third International and supported the USSR called themselves communists, and the ones who broke away or opposed the USSR called themselves socialists. So that used to be the difference. Nowadays they are used interchangeably. But this is also why the Third International is often called the Communist International, sometimes shortened to Comintern. Both of these words mean the Third International. In 1924, Lenin died, which ushered in the second period of the Third International, now under the leadership of Stalin. Stalin basically completely reversed the course of the organization. Under Lenin, it would found parties and support revolutions all over. Under Stalin, it was completely changed to just be about defending the Soviet Union, in line with his view about socialism in one country. Basically, he wanted to make the Soviet Union a bulwark of the revolution that could withstand counter-revolutionary invasions before spreading the revolution around the planet. Now, you may wonder what exactly was international about defending the USSR and like nothing else, but Stalin had a few words on that. An internationalist is one who is ready to defend the USSR without reservation, without wavering, unconditionally. For the USSR, it is the base of the world revolutionary movement, and this revolutionary movement cannot be defended and promoted without defending the USSR. Naturally, this shift of goals immediately alienated even more parties which left the Third International, while the ones that remained were slowly made incredibly similar to the way the Bolshevik Party itself was organized. By 1935, the Congress said that capitalism was in its final phase of decline and made all parties adopt hardline left-wing policies. For example, all moderate leftist parties were declared social fascists. Keep in mind that at the time, and especially to communists, fascism meant the last stage of capitalism, not a dictatorship like we usually mean today. They basically said everybody who isn't in the Third International is a counter-revolutionary. Of course, this alienated even more leftists because they wanted to ally with the moderate left to start a united front against like actual fascists like the Nazis. By 1935, the Third International held its final meeting and they changed that policy. They decided that all attending parties should form a united front with anyone opposing fascism, even non-communists. Of course, this was after the Nazis took power, so that didn't really come in time to change much. Then the International slowly fell apart. A lot of the members were accused of being counter-revolutionaries and removed by Stalin, and eventually World War II was over. The International was officially disbanded. This may have been Stalin trying to reassure the US and UK that he did not want to spread the revolution and that he accepts the post-war settlement. At this point, the International had been unofficially over for a decade, since it had no meetings between 35 and 45. The Third International was followed by the Cominform after the war, which was basically a place for all communist parties to meet. This would only include parties in countries that ended up on the socialist side of the Iron Curtain. It was dissolved after the death of Stalin, but even without it, the communist countries had incredibly tightly connected leaderships, which is why they're often called the Eastern Bloc. So, the Third International was formed to spread the Russian Revolution, but failed to do so and eventually led the leftists of the world to split into socialists and communists before being taken over by Stalin and basically used as a way for the USSR to get defended by other parties and countries in line with the idea of socialism in one country. Naturally, there were people opposing these ideas, and not just internationally but also within the Soviet Union. One of these people was the Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky. He hated Stalin and thought that the idea of socialism in one country was dumb and stupid. Instead, he advocated global revolution. The logic was that since capitalism is a global system, it can only be destroyed by a global workers' movement, not socialism in one country. For a few years, Trotsky led the opposition in the USSR, but by 1929 he was exiled along with most of his followers. They were called Trotskyists. Of course, banishing them did not shut them up. They just kept criticizing the USSR and everything it did from the outside. And if you paid attention, you know that this was during the time of the Third International, which was all about socialism in one country. The Trotskyists wouldn't stand for that, so they declared the Third International to be counter-revolutionaries and bad, and in 1938 they started their own international in France. Naturally, the doctrine of this international was world revolution. It was summed up by the so-called Transitional Program by Trotsky. And of course, there was only a very specific section of the left who attended this international. Basically, the only ones who showed up were Trotskyists and people who hadn't picked a side yet. Naturally, because these people were splitting the left and verbally attacking the Soviet Union, Stalin sent the NKVD to hunt down and kill the members, as they would do with Trotsky in 1940. But the International kept operating anyways, and it would by far outlast the Third International. After the war, they argued whether the Soviet Union, which they called a degenerated workers' state, was a bourgeois entity or not. They then focused on providing paths to revolution for colonized nations rather than industrialized ones. After all, you need colonies for a global revolution. At this time, Trotskyism became popular in Africa and South America, which in some countries it still is. In 1953, the Trotskyist party split over disagreement. Basically, the question was whether to form new purely Trotskyist parties or to join older workers' parties and reform them from within. They tried to mend the schism, and in 1963, most of the parties that had left returned. In between the schism and the unification, a decade had passed, and there were like 1 billion different internationals, usually for regions rather than the whole world. By 1963, most agreed that only the one Fourth International was the legitimate one. They decided to form the so-called International Committee of the Fourth International, which ended in never. It still exists. Like, they have a website. There are not many parties that listen to them anymore, but they occasionally still get called the Fourth International, even though technically they are a success organization and not the literal one Trotsky made. Of course, in line with leftism, a lot of leftists, even Trotskyists, deny the legitimacy of this committee, and they want to call for a new international. Yes, there are people asking for a fifth international. I couldn't believe it either. I was convinced the fifth international would be some Discord server that is trying to win the world record for the highest density of LARPers on the internet. But it turns out it's a real thing. Well, sort of, just real enough to warrant me talking about it for a few paragraphs. There were a whole bunch of people trying to call a fifth international, like the Spanish Workers' Party of Marxist Unification, which was kicked out of the Fourth International in 1938. Argentine Trotskyists called for one after being kicked out of the Fourth International in 1941, and an American in 1965. As you can tell, this is where the stereotype comes from that Trotskyists keep splitting their movement. In 2003, a bunch of communist parties called for a fifth international to happen in the near future. It never happened because nobody would attend, but the League of the Fifth International is still around, periodically sending emails to the European socialist parties. They even got a section in Austria, for some reason. In 2007, Hugo Chavez, the Vuvuzela no iPhone man, asked for a new international the following year. Lots of parties said they would attend it, but it likewise never happened, despite critical support from the League of the Fifth International. Ever since then, there has been no international or a proposition for one. Again, besides that committee from the Fourth International that is still hanging around somewhere. So yeah, in conclusion, the point of the internationals was always to unify the left and promote revolution, but it failed pretty much every time. The first international was supposed to bring libertarian leftists and Marxists closer together and decide on a unified theory of revolution, which failed and split anarchists from socialists. The second international was supposed to keep the European socialists unified during the increasing militarism before World War I. They failed, and the reformists, leftist parties, which we today would call social democrats, split away from the socialist movement. Then the third international, or communist international, at first was a way to start more revolutions on the planet, and then a way for Stalin to defend the Soviet Union, which caused a split between those who sided with the USSR and those who were opposed to it, which at the time were called communists and socialists. But don't use that distinction because nobody will know what you mean. And then the Fourth International was an attempt by Trotsky to offer an alternative for those who didn't like to side with the USSR in the Third International, which just split the left further into Trotskyists and those leftover socialists that didn't fall into any of the previous groups. And then the Trotskyists split from the Trotskyists, and some of that organization is still around. And that was a very basic history of the internationals. As you can see, we went from having one group called leftists to having Marxists, anarchists, social democrats, Leninists, Trotskyists, and other leftists, all of which hate each other and will likely never achieve anything because of this. The end. If that made you depressed, why don't you donate to my Patreon to join my Discord server so we can play Minecraft together to fill the void. Yes, I actually bought the Minecraft server specifically so my patrons and me can play in the new update in a few days. Oh, and of course, you only need to donate once, and like you can stay in the Discord and Minecraft server forever. I'm not that greedy, I'm just greedy enough to make enough money to call this channel my part-time job for tax purposes. Of course, if you pay me more, you can also end up in the outro like here. And if you donate a lot, I will read out your name like this. Darius the Bird, Eric Betts, Harris Hawk, Zaur Kyle, V, Sandra Corvus, Attila Nemetz, Carissa, Daniel Hyman, Dominic Cusanelli, Emily Marigold Klassen, Perdina, Josh C, Klastrup, Lilith Craft, Mamuka, Tsikulari, Marxism Tonight, Nane Pema, Poet, Ramen DeVille, Red Shark Trooper, Sean Murphy, Skylar Magnum Turner, Stairmaster Chef, Kayla CH, and Trey.